Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, COVID-19 and Young Australians, Long-Term Effects of a Pandemic. My name is Stewart Lockie. Before we get underway tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country across which we're all scattered tonight and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. This week is Social Sciences Week. Social Sciences Week is organised by a range of professional associations and universities across Australia to promote awareness of how the social sciences can help us understand and respond to a range of the really big issues that face us as a society. Now, if we think specifically around young people, the sorts of big issues we were thinking about as early as the beginning of this year, what automation means for the world of work, how technology, social media, and so on affects things like privacy and identity, how climate change and sustainability will be shaping our lives, how globalisation reshapes our notions of identity and citizenship. None of these issues have gone away. But the COVID-19 pandemic does put a somewhat different complexion on things. This webinar is brought to you by the social scientists at JCU, and I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to getting it organised. We've seen this as an opportunity to draw in our colleagues from elsewhere, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Jenny Chesters to you from the University of Melbourne as tonight's speaker. If you have questions during the presentation, we won't take the questions as we go, but what we will do is ask you to use the Zoom question and answer function, which will open up a pop-up box into which you can type your questions. We'll collect those questions and work through them at the end. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Jenny Chesters.
Thanks very much, Stuart, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm actually in a very cold part of Australia at the moment. Believe it or not, it's still quite cold down here in Victoria. Frosty in weather, but also frosty in other aspects of life, as you can imagine. I'm working at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne, and I want to share some research that I've been doing in the last year or so with you tonight. So by way of introduction, I want to send you back to the beginning of the COVID shutdowns, which happened at the end of March across Australia. And it was the first time for many people that they realised how precarious our labour market was. Suddenly people received text messages to say, don't come to work, we're shut. And people went en masse down to their local Centrelink office to try and register for unemployment benefits. For many people in the social sciences, though, we've been watching the problems with precarity in the labour market for a number of years, and this situation was of no surprise to us. Unfortunately, it's young people that tend to bear the brunt of labour market contractions. This has happened across time. If we think back to the recessions in 1983 and 1992, 93, and also at the peak of the global financial crisis, it was the youth unemployment rates that were far higher than those of the general workforce. Entering the labour market during a recession has lifetime effects on one's employment trajectory, your earnings, and even your levels of happiness. And this is something that I'll be talking about a little bit more in this presentation. I want to talk to you a little bit about a paper that I wrote last year with a colleague in Switzerland. We were interested in looking at levels of happiness, and we used national data from Australia at the HILDA data, which is a national panel study, and national data from Switzerland, which is also a national panel study there. And both of these studies have been collecting data since around the year 2001. So last year we had 16 years of data that we could look at to see how happiness changes over time. We knew from previous research that particular groups of people were likely to have lower levels of life satisfaction, according to their age. As one becomes older, life satisfaction increases. We also know that there are period effects on life satisfaction. And this is what we were interested in testing. We're actually interested to see if the global financial crisis had a negative impact on young people's level of happiness. We expected that young people who were aged around 16 to 20 years in 2011 would have lower levels of happiness compared to older people in 2011. And we also thought that they might have lower levels of happiness compared to people aged 16 to 20 years in 2001 and 2006. However, that's not what we found. In fact, what we found was a very strong association between being born in 1961 and 1965 and levels of happiness. For some reason, this cohort, only in Australia, were the least happy people across time. And this was a bit of a puzzle for us because it didn't happen in Switzerland. So what happened in Australia for this cohort of people? We didn't think it was anything to do with the time period that we had from 2001 and 2016. So I looked back at what happened when this cohort entered the labour market. And what I found was, by looking at the unemployment rates, what I found was that the youth unemployment rate between 1971 and 1977 had this amazing trajectory. Up until 1974, young people aged 15 to 19 years, the unemployment rate was around 4%. And it jumped up dramatically between 74 and 75 to be 10%. And by 1977, it was 15%. And you might be thinking, well, 15 to 19 years, why is that important? It's important because in the late 70s, that was the age when the majority of young people left school. Only around 1/3 of young people went on to finish senior secondary, currently years 11 and 12. The majority of young people left school at age 15 or 16 and went into entry-level jobs in the labour market or started an apprenticeship. So they were full-time employed. But this all stopped in 1975 quite dramatically, and that is a huge increase in unemployment. It tripled in a matter of 3 years. And we think that this is why this cohort were less happy even 40 years later when they were in their 50s. So some of the things I'll be talking to about today, I just want to clarify some of the terminology. When we talk about the unemployment rate, that's a percentage of people who are in the labour force but are not employed. The underemployment rate is a percentage of people who are employed part-time, but they want to work additional hours. The labour force is everyone who is employed or is seeking to be employed. To be classified as unemployed, you must be willing and able to work. You're not unemployed if you're working 1 hour per week, and you're not regarded as being unemployed if you're sick and unable to work. That is a standard definition across the world, actually, so it's not just in Australia. The reason I wanted to share that terminology with you is in the next section of this talk, I'm going to be talking about underemployment rates and unemployment rates across the period 1978 to 2020. That period is selected because that's when the Australian Bureau of Statistics has the data available in a spreadsheet. So if I try and look before that, like I did for the previous graph, I actually have to download every publication and map it myself. So it's much easier just using 1978 to 2020. I'll be looking at 3 age groups here, the 15 to 19-year-olds, the 20 to 24-year-olds, and the 25 to 35-year-olds. I'm going to show you a series of graphs, and I want you to look at the spikes at each of the recessions. So unemployment and underemployment spikes up in 1983, 1992, 93, 2009, even though we didn't have a recession, we had a huge contraction in the labour market, and the current spike for 2020. And I want you to bear in mind that this spike in 2020 is unprecedented because the cause of this economic contraction is a pandemic, and we don't know how long this will last. There are no guarantees with the pandemic, and there's no guarantees at how long some places, particularly Victoria at the moment, will be in lockdown. So the first graph here you'll see are the increase in unemployment here in 83, recovers, comes back up again in 92, 93, recovers somewhat. Great year 2008, lots of jobs. Recession, the global financial crisis hits in 2009, it spikes up. And it's bounced around a bit since 2009, but you'll see that it has never recovered to what it was before the global financial crisis. And here's the spike here for 2020. These are the figures for May each year. Now, looking at the next age group, the 20 to 24-year-olds, you can see that the spikes are more pronounced there, and also here for the 2020. The blue bars here are the underemployment rate. They're the people who are working part-time but want to work more hours. And you'll see here in the 1970s and 1980s, they made a small proportion of the people who were underutilised. The proportion of people who are underemployed has increased over time quite substantially. And you'll see now, if you look at the orange bars, they're actually smaller than the blue bars, which means that people are employed, but they're not working enough hours. So they can't move on with their lives in a sense because they've only got part-time or casual work. This is a graph that concerns me the most because these are the people aged 25 to 34 years. And this is an age group when we would expect that most people will have finished their education. They will be looking for full-time work so they can settle down, maybe move in with a lifetime partner, maybe get a mortgage. But you can see there that they are the group that have had the worst, in a sense, increase in their level of unemployment and underemployment. And currently 1 in 5 adults in this age group are either seeking more work or seeking work altogether. So just think about what these graphs illustrate. They tell us that economic recoveries are taking longer. We still haven't recovered from the global financial crisis in terms of employment. A lot of full-time jobs and a lot of permanent jobs were lost during the global financial crisis, and they never came back. They were replaced with jobs that are what we call gigs. A gig here and a gig there. You might get 2 days work here and 2 days work there. You might get a few shifts here and a few shifts there, but you can't get a full-time permanent job. That's the reality for a lot of people. The fact that unemployment and underemployment rates haven't returned to their pre-GFC levels tells us that there's an underlying issue with our labour market. Therefore, the situation was dire before the pandemic. So what are some of the outcomes of these high rates of unemployment and underemployment? Well, when you have excess capacity in the labour market, employers have more power. They're able to offer part-time or casual work because people will take any work that they can get. People don't want to be unemployed, they want to be working. And so a gig here and a gig there is better than no gig at all. So a sizable proportion of young people cannot secure full-time employment. And so that's what you see in those figures. They're unemployed or underemployed. And this delays the markers of adulthood. We typically regard the markers of adulthood of, say, relationship commitments such as marriage, financial commitments such as buying a home, and of course the lifelong commitment of parenting. And these become delayed as people seek to secure a permanent job before they go into these other lifetime commitments. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that I'm working on at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. It's called the Life Patterns Project, and it's an ARC funded project, and the chief investigators are Joanna Wynne, Helen Cahill and Dan Woodman. And this project has been tracking 2 cohorts of young people since they left secondary school. Cohort 1 left secondary school in 1991, and they're currently aged around 48 years. And cohort 2 we've tracked, have been tracked since 2005 when they were in year 11, and they left secondary school in 2006. And they're currently aged around 33 years. Earlier this year, we put together a book that was published And it talks about these two cohorts and how they've managed their transition into adulthood through these very difficult times. One thing that we should remember with the labour market, with it being in flux, and it, like I said, it has been for quite some time, that these changes in the labour market create different employment opportunities. The jobs that were available 10 years ago or 20 years ago might not be available now, or may not be available in the future. Another thing that's happening with the labour market is there's an influx of highly educated people. We've had a mass higher education system in Australia since the 1990 reforms, and this has increased competition for high status careers. In the past, a bachelor degree was regarded as an entry-level position, an entry-level qualification to get into a professional career. But more and more, it's becoming a master's level qualification that's required. Another thing that's happening is there's a lot of changes due to technological innovations. People have to go to back to education at some point to upgrade their skills. The skills they have it might just mean a refresher, or it might be that the career they chose is no longer viable and they need to get new skills to have a new career. Therefore, returning to education is now quite common. In fact, by 2017, 60% of the cohort who left school in 1991 had gained a new qualification after the age of 25. So they had a qualification perhaps before 25, but then 60% of them went back to either vocational education and training or university to get a new qualification. And I'll just show you the graph of that. So you can see here the spike. This is the age when we expect most people will have finished their education. Well, traditionally, graduating with a bachelor degree was the marker. But you can see there that every year, people in this cohort have graduated from some form of tertiary education. The age when they completed their last qualification, even in the 40s, people are going back and completing educational qualifications. And this tells us that there's something going on between education and employment that's very important. Why would people be going back to education if they were settled in a career and they were happy with it? We don't actually interview or survey our people in the first cohort every year. In fact, we haven't surveyed them since 2017. We're currently surveying those people now, and we don't have the results yet. But we did survey cohort 2 in 2018. So we had a look at why they were going back to education. And we found that even though 75% of them agreed that their qualification helped them get their current job, 16% of them were currently studying. So this is when they're aged around about 30 years. They're currently studying. Of those, half of them were seeking new employment opportunities. So it might be that they weren't satisfied in their current career, or maybe they hadn't been able to get a full-time job in the field that they studied in. So they went back to seek a new career. 19% were required by their employer to study, so they needed to upgrade their skills. And another 15% were studying because they were seeking a promotion. There was only a small percentage of people who said that they were studying for intrinsic reasons, such as they wanted to know more about something, or they were doing it for the sheer joy of learning. Mostly they were labour market reasons. One thing that we've been looking at in the last couple of years is how employment and education are interconnected. And we've looked at the employment outcomes of our participants. I would just want to talk a little bit about our cohort 2 participants, because that's the group that we survey every year, and we have around 500 people still in that particular cohort. For many of them, despite having a university level of education, many of them have experienced precarious employment. For some people, it's taken them 5 years after graduation to get a full-time job or a permanent job. And that's because precarious employment is now a feature of labour markets. It's built in. It's not something that's going to go away. It's been growing since the 70s and 80s, and it's now quite entrenched. And because of the precariousness of employment, a lot of people are changing jobs and they're changing careers. If you're a young person and you're trying to think about, well, I want to get married and I want to have a family, you might want to have a secure job before you do that. You might want to have some kind of guaranteed income. Of course, for all of us now with the pandemic, that's all up in the air. But even before the pandemic, a lot of people were considering, is this the right time to be having a family if I don't actually have a permanent job and I don't have a home of my own? So here are some quotes from people in our survey. What we do in the survey is we ask lots of questions, but then we provide spaces for people to give their comments. And around 80% of our participants do take the time to provide comments. And so we conducted a content analysis of their comments, and we've selected a few of the comments that I think might be interesting for you. For this young woman who was living with her parents in Melbourne, she says that after graduation, I was unable to find jobs in the field of my study, so I chose a different career path. Fortunately, I enjoy working as a manager, and I've stayed with the same company since graduating in 2013. Another young woman who's living in a share house in Melbourne said, I'm not working in my field of study, however, I'm very happy with my job. I feel like the skills that I learnt through that study and in the few years in a relevant field contributed to the success in my role now. And another young woman who was living in Canberra said, I'm happy where I'm working. My degree gave me general skills that make me employable in many areas. However, I'm not using the specific knowledge that I learnt in my degree. So even though these women are saying, look, I went to uni and I studied in a particular field. I didn't get a job in that field, but it's okay. I'm quite happy with the job that I have now. Sometimes we don't know what we want when we're at university, and it's not until we get in the labour market that we find, well, maybe this job isn't so bad after all. Another young woman said that my degrees helped to get my current job, not so much by the content, but by teaching me more generic skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, and constructing evidence-based arguments. My current job is quite generalist, so these skills are more useful than specific specialist knowledge. This young woman already has a dual degree in science and law and is currently studying her master's in public policy. A young woman living in regional Tasmania wrote that while I did law, I didn't end up going down that path. I used the journalism part of my arts degree to become a political reporter, and law certainly helped me with that job. A young woman who completed her degree at the end of 2011 said, I had some initial trouble securing a job because I was fussy about the sort of work that I wanted to do. And eventually I accepted that I mightn't have the dream job straight away and that I would have to work towards it. 6 years on, I've just started what I think is my dream job, but all the experiences on the way got me here. So in other words, if you don't get the dream job that you want, don't despair, just keep working towards it. Keep your eye on the goal, but take jobs that may be closely related or maybe not so closely related. But having an employment career is better than having an unemployment career. And the final one I want to show you is a young woman who's currently living in London. Well, she was back in 2018, and she was working in the field that she studied in. Her master's had given her the opportunity to live and work abroad. She's a speech pathologist. So why does employment matter? Well, it matters for a number of reasons. It's not just about having a secure income. Those people who are out of work at the moment because a business that they work for is shut down, they might be getting job seeker and they're getting the job seeker supplement. But life is about more than that. It's not just about having some money to pay your bills and buy the things that you need. Having a job provides non-pecuniary benefits, such as having a regular routine. Having a reason to get up in the morning can be quite important. It also gives you an opportunity to be socially connected. The people that you work with, the team that you're working in, the customers that you're dealing with. It encourages you to be engaged in civic activities, volunteering, and those sorts of things. And it also gives you social status. And these are very important. It's not so much whether or not you like your job, it's whether it gives you some sense of social status, some sense of standing in the community. But precarious employment doesn't provide these benefits. There's no regular routine when you're in precarious employment. You don't know whether you're working tomorrow. You don't know where you'll be working tomorrow. You're waiting for a text message from one of your loosely connected jobs that you have. It's difficult to be socially connected because you're moving from job to job, from place to place. It's also difficult to volunteer and be engaged in other civic activities because you can't make commitments to volunteer on a particular day if you don't know whether you'll be working or not. Because obviously, if you have a text message saying, well, you've got a shift tomorrow, be here at 2 o'clock, that takes precedence, because if you don't take the shift, you might not be offered another one. So it's hard to be engaged in volunteering. And it's hard to say that you have too much social status. You start feeling like you're just a commodity to be used when necessary and cast off when not necessary. So precarious employment is not the kind of employment that most people are seeking. One thing that could set you apart in the labour market is having what we call 21st century skills. These are important, and they're important because the jobs in the future will be relying on these skills. One of the most important skills that people need to have is you need to be able to transform and interpret information in new ways using new technology. I struggle a little bit with this new technology called Zoom. I've been lecturing for a number of years, about 15 years, and I find interacting with new technology, i.e. Zoom, quite difficult because I don't have an audience. I don't have any way of reading the audience and providing the audience with what I think they expect next. In a sense, we're working in a vacuum, but we have to be able to transform our job and our ways of teaching into that new technology. And that's the same across all different fields. Another very important skill that people need to have is the social and emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. You need to be able to work with people, regardless of whether you like them or not. You need to be adept at understanding people's moods. You need to be able to reach out and talk to people if they seem to be struggling at any time. Being able to work in teams is so important, and it doesn't matter if you learnt your teamwork skills in playing a sport like football or rugby union or rugby league or the AFL, netball, basketball, hockey, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you learnt your teamwork skills by being in a choir or an orchestra or a band, or whether you learnt them by being in the debating team or in a musical at school or a school play. Teamwork skills are about knowing what your role is in the team and doing the best you can to fulfill that role. But it's also about looking out to see whether other people are coping or whether they're struggling. And that's why you need to have the ability to support your co-workers. We have a saying at the moment down here in Victoria about we're all in this together. That's kind of what that's about. It's about looking out for each other and making sure that people aren't falling behind or getting left out. Another skill that's important is you must be able to have demonstrate your cross-cultural competency. You can't decide when you're working who you're going to work with. You don't know who the employer is going to put on. You don't usually have any say in that. You have to be able to work with people regardless of their cultural background. This is really important, and it's becoming more important because we're a globalized world now. So there are people from all different countries and all different backgrounds working in Australia, and we need to work with them. Another skill that's very important is the ability to identify and solve problems. I often wonder whether the smartest people are in the room. I use the example of the Murray-Darling Basin, and if you're in New South Wales or Victoria or South Australia, you'll understand why I talk about this. This is a huge project that was to save the Murray-Darling Basin and keep the rivers flowing, but it just doesn't seem to have worked out that well. And so I often question, are the smartest people in the room? Who put together the plan and who put together the rollout of the plan? And right now we can use the pandemic as an example. Are the smartest people in the room? Who are making the decisions? Who makes the decisions about JobKeeper and JobSeeker? Who makes the decisions about how we're going to figure out a roadmap out of our recession? We need people who can identify problems and solve problems. Identifying problems is an important step, but then we need people who can solve them. So one thing that I often say to my students is think about the Apollo missions. I know that was a long time ago, but there was a movie that quite interested me about the Apollo mission where they were running out of oxygen, and they only had a 48-hour supply, I think it was. And the people back in America who were monitoring the mission had 48 hours to find a way to solve the problem. And so they locked all the engineers into a room and said, you're not coming out to solve the problem. Here is the resources that they have in the space ship. And this is, you have to work out a way that they can get their oxygen. And they managed to do it. But it's because they each knew their role, they each knew their skills, and they worked together. They knew what the problem was and they worked to solve the problem. Another skill that you need to have is the ability to critically assess information and data. So what is it about this data? Is it useful? We've seen lots of graphs recently about the COVID-19 pandemic all around the world, and particularly in Australia. But what do these data mean? How do we read these data? How can we make use of them? We also need the ability to extend our knowledge independently. Nobody's going to tell you what you need to know. You're going to have to figure that out, and you're going to have the ability to go and find it out, to do your own research. So when I had the issue with the 1961 to 1965 cohort, it wasn't obvious to any of us in the team why that would be the case, why that cohort and why only in Australia. And it was only that I remembered back to the 1970s that I recalled that there was a massive increase in youth unemployment. And I went to the ABS data and to see whether that could be the cause. You need to be able to extend your knowledge. No one's going to tell you what you need to learn. So when you're looking for a career, rather than focus on particular careers and mastering specialised skills, you may benefit from developing a general appreciation of learning new and unfamiliar skills. There's no such thing as a comfort zone anymore. That's not going to get you anywhere. You need to be open to learning new skills and applying those skills to unfamiliar situations. Forget about the comfort zone. It's not like that anymore. Careers don't last a lifetime. Some may last a lifetime, but very few careers will last a lifetime. Because as technology updates, your skills have to be updated. And over time, those skills might become redundant and those jobs might disappear. So you might be looking for a new job. People who are flexible and are able to change careers are the people who are willing to learn and willing to, as I say, be flexible about how they apply their knowledge. We have to be able to adapt to new technologies. And this is for everyone who's currently in the labour market. We don't know what's going to happen next year. Maybe the recession will end, maybe it won't. Maybe there will be plenty of jobs, maybe there won't. But we have to be able to adapt what we know and the skills that we have to any new technologies that come along. Because employers will be changing. They'll be using this period of time when nobody's in the offices. They'll be thinking about You know, how will we change the way we work? Will we even have offices when the pandemic's over? And the last thing that I have on this list is you need to be able to transfer your skills to new employment opportunities. And you need to think about, if I learn how to do something really specific, will I be able to transfer that skill? And that's why if you're looking at skills such as critical thinking, you can apply that in any situation. Having that kind of a skill, a generic skill like that, is quite useful. So summing up, I just want to say that entering the labour market during a recession has lifelong consequences. The research that I've done, and I talked a little bit about today, but also in the past, shows that people have lower levels of happiness even 40 years later. It's not just that their level of happiness is lower, they also have lower lifetime earnings and they have interrupted employment trajectories. It's hard to get started in a recession. It's probably not a good time to be entering a labour market. The pandemic recession could last for several years, and this will depress demand for workers. People who enter the labour market now might be unemployed for a period of 8, 10, 12 months. It's very difficult if you have that on your CV, even though you can say, yeah, well, there was a recession, there was a pandemic, everybody's in the same boat. But an employer is looking for someone who doesn't have that scar on their employment record. They're looking for somebody who just finished school or just finished university when they're going to hire. They don't want someone who's been waiting 12 months for a job. The other thing that I want to remind you is that precarious employment is now an entrenched feature of the labour market. Hoping to transition from full-time education into full-time employment is very rare that you can achieve that. It's rare because the majority of jobs now are less than full-time, and not permanent. There's a lot of jobs that used to be permanent and no longer are. For example, I didn't give you the quotes today, but we have doctors who are in our life patterns survey who say that even after 10 years of university, they're still working 1-year contracts, and they don't know from 1 year to the next whether they will have a contract coming up. So this is what I mean by it's entrenched in the labour market. So what you need to be thinking about is what skills are transferable across occupations. Skills such as critical thinking, social emotional intelligence, and teamwork. They're the sorts of skills that get you through. So that's all from me. I'd like to say thank you. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the life patterns research that I talked about today is funded by the Australian Research Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you everybody who has been listening in. I'd like to remind you to pop your questions into the Q&A box. If you hover your mouse down near the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon right in the middle of the bottom row Q&A. And if you stick your questions in there, we can cover them. There's just a few too many people on the line for me to try and keep a hold of anyone who's sticking up a hand trying to ask a question directly. While we wait for some questions to come in, Jenny, can I ask a couple just to kick things off?
Yep.
As a university, we're doing a number of things to encourage people to stay enrolled or to enroll next year. We've got student success packages, which are our, I guess, marketing terms for a range of initiatives to help current Year 12 students whose study is disrupted get into university next year. Now, are we doing the right thing by students encouraging them to get in?
Well, I would strongly encourage young people to consider to keep studying. The last thing you want to be doing is entering a labour market in the next year or so, because it's going to be a difficult labour market for at least the next 2 years. So improving your standing by increasing your level of education is a good thing to do. And even if you haven't really thought about studying, maybe at a university or in a vet sector, maybe it's time to reconsider that, because there's no point being unemployed. I mean, you're better off to be studying. At least you'll have, when people say to you, oh, what are you doing this year? You can say, well, I'm studying at university, you know, at least I have a chance, rather than saying, oh, I'm just unemployed waiting for a job to come up.
Okay, so you're making sure you don't have a gap in your CV whilst building skills. Now, we've got a question on a related topic from Tricia Telford. Tricia's asking whether there's any particular fields that buck the trends. So I guess Tricia means fields in which we do see a high proportion of people going into full-time work and in the same area. So, and she's provided teaching as an example.
Thanks, Trish. That's an important question. What we found, though, is that even in teaching, in our research, teachers don't get a full-time permanent job straight out of their degree. And even teachers in Melbourne who might have done a Master of Education rather than a Bachelor of Education, even they sometimes struggle to get a full-time permanent job. So you might get a one-year contract, and then you have to try and get another contract after that. And for some people that, I didn't show you the quotes in this presentation, but some of the people that are in our study are saying they've had a year-on-year contract for the last 5 or 6 years, and they're at the point of giving up being a teacher because they just find it too stressful. They don't know whether they'll have a job next year. So there's no real occupation that I could say, well, this is guaranteed. I think we need to take that on board and go, okay, how can I prepare myself for the eventuality that I might not get a permanent job or a full-time job when I'm finished my education?
Okay, we've got a comment from Beth Moore. Beth has said she'd like to thank you very much. I think she means you, not me, Jenny, for an informative and interesting talk. Born in 1962, leaving school in grade 11 to work full-time, Beth has been employed her entire working life and didn't realise how lucky she was. Now, I have to say, Beth, the first time I heard some of the data being reported out of this study several years ago, I was in exactly the same position, or not so long after you, and you know, I'd been aware of the whole theory about Generation X, that we left school or we left university and there was a recession and we couldn't find work and we were all miserable, and spent our lives watching Winona Ryder and Ethan Hawke films. And I thought, that goodness, that's not my life. But then I saw the results here, and clearly from a lot of people that was real. So I'm going to turn Beth's observation into a question, Jenny, and say, well, so the data show, I guess, how on average these cohorts are different. But is it the same for everybody, or how much variation is there in the experience of those cohorts?
Obviously, there's variation. I mean, we know that people who left school in the late 70s but then went to university had a completely different trajectory than the young people who left school at 15 or 16 and tried to go straight into the labour market. And the unemployment rate is high. It's a shock to a lot of people that they couldn't get a job, but obviously some people did get jobs. What happened after that shock was that between 1983 and 1993, the number of young people who completed secondary school doubled. There's an amazing graph that shows that. So the rate went up from about 35% to 65 to 70% in a matter of 10 years. And that's because young people gave up trying to get jobs straight out of school and decide, well, not straight out of school, but straight out of school at age 15 or 16, and decided they had a better chance if they finished grade 12. So we always talk in averages when we give statistics, but there will always be some people who buck the trend. Personally, I was quite lucky because I left school midway through year 11. In those days, it was called senior school, fifth form. And I managed to get a job without any trouble at age 16, working full-time in a bank with no training, no experience, nothing. It was, okay, you want a job, here's a job, full-time. That doesn't happen anymore. And I know that if I had tried to do that 12 months later in 1975, I might not have been able to get a job because the job's dried up.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jenny. So I've got a similar comment from Rachel Plummer, who's a bit younger. She's a millennial. So that's a key difference. People can start to define themselves now by the generational markers. But Rachel also, began ongoing contract teaching soon after graduating and didn't realise how lucky she was and how rare that was. So her question, what advice would you give to year 11, 12 students this year who perhaps don't want to go into higher educational TAFE and want to take a gap year to work part-time?
It depends on your situation. If you already have a job and that's not a job that you've had during school, then maybe that would work. Probably not the case if you're in Victoria. Not many people have those jobs at the moment. Even retail is shut down in the centre of Melbourne. So it really depends on your circumstances. But I wouldn't be encouraging people to take a gap year. My daughters all took a gap year and that was fine. That it was a great year for them and they came back with new skills and they went to university and did very well. But they were able to travel overseas. If you take a gap year now, you're not going to be able to travel overseas. You might have your part-time job, you might not, because we don't know how long the pandemic recession is going to last. It'll depend on your local circumstances. If you're in Queensland, you might be fine, but people in Victoria intending to take a gap year might want to seriously consider, is it going to be worth it? It's not going to get any easier over time.
Well, an interesting observation from Tricia Telford again, who is curious to see whether the gap year has a gap due to COVID, and we have an increase in university numbers as well. I was actually wondering whether Rachel, who posed the question about the gap year, had a bit of an agenda in maybe discouraging a friend or relative from taking a gap year. And I'm tempted to follow up by asking whether people should also abandon their plans for schoolies, just in case my daughter's still on the line. But let's leave that. So another question here from, I'm going to mispronounce your name, so apologies, Liquat Ahmadi. Thanks for a great presentation. Question for Jenny, your thoughts on how increased youth unemployment might affect culturally and linguistically diverse communities after the pandemic?
Good question. We don't know. The thing is that it depends on where you're looking for a job. So you need to target employers that are looking for the particular skills that you have. And if you have two languages, and most people who are linguistically diverse have more than one language, this could actually be a bonus. So, you know, we don't know. It's also very difficult to know a person's likes and dislikes and what they want to do in their career or their life after school. But I would be saying to people, take a stock take now and say, what skills do I have? Can I speak two languages? Great. Even having the ability to use Auslan is, you know, a great career at the moment, because all of these people who are doing these press conferences have an Auslan signer right next to them. And who would have thought that would have been a great career move? But, you know, you just don't know. The pandemic and the recession will throw up new opportunities, and you need to be in a position where you can say, these are the skills that I have. Maybe there's a job for me out there using these skills. Everybody has skills. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Focus on your strengths and look for jobs that fit with those strengths.
Okay, now, question from Nick Osbalderston. Before COVID-19, we were having a massive debate about automation and what that means for jobs. Could you comment on what automation may still well mean for the future of work?
Yeah, well, we were having that discussion, and we were quite concerned about how things would play out in the next 10 years or so. We were looking at the kinds of jobs that would disappear completely. But what COVID has done, in a sense, has reminded us that jobs that require people skills are not going anywhere. We're still going to need people to care. We're going to need people who can solve problems. We need people in the public service who can solve problems. We need people in industry who can solve problems. These skills are not replaceable. I mean, even if you run everything on an algorithm, you end up with the robo-debt disaster that the government is trying to clear up now. You end up with what happened in England, where an algorithm decided people's A-levels. We can't just rely on algorithms. So the jobs that we thought might end up being automated might not in the long run, particularly if you have the critical thinking skills that are necessary. Algorithms don't think critically. Statistics don't think critically. Okay, so you need to be able to interpret those pieces of data and those programs and those algorithms to see what's going to happen. It concerns me that an algorithm is telling me what I want to read in my news feed or whose posts I want to see on Facebook. That concerns me. But, you know, we live with that, but we have to think, is there a better way? Is there some skills that we could have as people who are looking for jobs? What skills do we need? And like I said before, problem solving, critical thinking, they're skills that won't be automated. It's not possible. Caring for people isn't going to be automated.
Nick's made a follow-up observation about, you know, there being a number of, I guess, fundamental structural changes in the labour market that the pandemic both follows and reinforces. So the world of work's clearly going to change. I'm going to roll that up though with a question from Hannah Sung, who has said that she understands that youth need to take responsibility and chart their path and need to make some smart decisions now about study and work. But what policy advice would you be recommending to government to facilitate and strengthen the social infrastructure that will increase youth employment and reduce underemployment?
That's a really good question. And I think that governments at the moment at federal level and state level, and to some extent the local level, they have funds. They have funds that they can access. And those funds could be used to employ young people. I heard recently that the government in the ACT is rolling out job creation programs. I think this is a good time to do that. Rather than having people unemployed and paying them money to not do too much at all, why not give them some of those other benefits of working and give them a full-time job for 2 years? That should see them through the pandemic. This is a policy decision that governments can make, particularly the federal government. It's important that we invest in people. It's not just about keeping people alive long enough to get through the pandemic. It's about investing in people and investing in our social structure to make sure that people have opportunities to work.
So Jenny, if I could just keep you going there, what about things like social enterprises and other ways of organising economic activity that are? It seems like a lot of, you know, government-run employment schemes focus on building roads, building transport infrastructure, which probably absorb a lot of capital relative to the number of jobs that are actually generated. Are there better ways of building the social infrastructure?
Absolutely. Instead of building all those roads and that kind of infrastructure, we could be building social housing. We could be getting people who are in precarious employment into less precarious housing. I mean, we have people who are homeless purely because they can't afford rent. And that might be because they're in precarious employment or unemployment. We need a massive investment in social housing in Australia. We need a massive investment in other forms of social infrastructure, programs that keep young people off the streets, programs that keep young people connected with society. We need all of those things and we need people to do it. And now is a good time to be making those investments. Interest rates are 0.25. The Reserve Bank interest rate is 0.25 of 1%. Money has never been this cheap. And there's no reason why the government can't use that very cheap money to invest in social housing and other enterprises.
Okay, we've got a question from Lauren Moxie. Do you think it's fair to say that the effects of high unemployment rates are compounded when young people whose parents entered the workforce in a recession also tried to do the same? Are family wealth and mental health impacted more than usual? So is there an intergenerational effect that particularly impacts some families?
Yes, the short answer to that is yes. So if your parents were born 1961 to 1965 and they entered the labour market at age 15, 16 and couldn't get a job straight away, and they've had that scarring across their lifetime of employment and are less happy in their lives, then of course that will impact on the life that the children will have. There's differences, of course, according to socioeconomic status. So people who left school at 15 or 16 aren't typically from the high SES families. Back in the 70s, high SES people were far more likely to go to university than low SES people. And that's an important thing to remember, that going to university in those days was not something that working class people even thought about. That was something that high SES people did. And that's why 65% of young people left school at age 15 or 16. So we're already looking at a group that really were disadvantaged, and then they were the ones that bore the brunt of the labour market contraction in the 1970s, the late 1970s. Of course it has a generational effect, but some people have taken the opportunity to go to university at a later stage in life, and they've made a good go of it. They've got a different job, they've got a bit of a career, and they feel more comfortable. It's a very complex situation. Not everybody whose parents were born in 1961 to 1965 will be disadvantaged, but on average they will be.
I think one of the important differences between now and people making one of the differences for people making the transition now compared to the 70s is the availability within universities of bridging programs. And Lauren won't be aware of this because she's based in Sydney, but here in Cairns, where we have a large number of students who are first in family coming to JCU, we also have a very high enrolment in pathway programs, which are specifically designed to help people into higher education who perhaps haven't had the right academic background, or who may have taken a break from study for a while.
And those programs are actually offered at every university in Australia. Sometimes they're restricted to particular groups such as Indigenous students, but in most universities there is a pathway program. It might be called tertiary preparation, it might be called bridging. And this is something that I would strongly encourage people who hadn't perhaps done so well at high school, at secondary school, to consider, because in these programs you actually are prepared for university life. I've actually conducted analysis of university administration data for two universities, one at the University of the Sunshine Coast and one at the University of Canberra, with my colleague Louise Watson. And we found that students who came in through these bridging programs actually did better at these two particular universities than the students who came in direct entry from high school. And that's because the students who came in through direct entry didn't have the actual university type skills that they needed, the understanding of time management, the understanding of how the university worked, the understanding that it's okay to fail one subject, you'll recover. So we actually found that these pathway programs prepared students for university life far better than students coming direct entry.
Very true. Now, of course, you're absolutely right that all universities have pathway programs, but for anybody thinking about studying in Cairns, just remember the JCU's ones are better than all our competitors. Now, we hadn't necessarily conceived of this seminar as a non-stop advertisement for higher education, but I think it's not just interesting, it's it's important that there are very strong signals in the data, in very robust longitudinal data, which provides some good clues as to what people need to do now in dealing with the uncertainty induced by the pandemic and the uncertainty induced by other changes in the labour market, to be really taking up that advice about making sure that if they're not working full-time, they're studying and not developing those holes in their CVs. It's 8 p.m, so I'm going to thank everybody for participating. Thank Jenny for Zooming in all the way from freezing Victoria. I'm not going to say anything about all the windows of my house being open and thinking about turning on a fan and making her feel bad. But I'm going to thank all of you who've participated online, and look forward to the day when we can all get together again face to face for one of these seminars. Good night.
Thanks, Stuart. Bye.